was the resettlement of spirits around a dam in Uganda, Bujigali Dam on the Nile, where for centuries, for millennia, people had gone to this particular site to worship and to commune with the spirits. And so the process by which everybody for whom those spirits was important had to be brought into a process to understand whether or not they could be moved, or how they would view the dam and how they would view life after the dam, was probably one of the most complicated things that I was ever involved in. What was also complicated was trying to brief the board of the World Bank Group on why, so your erstwhile central bank and finance ministry officials, on why it was important for this, if this piece of infrastructure was to go forward, that we had to work with the spirits, and that if we weren't, then there would definitely be all kinds of other unintended conflicts around the site. And the other one, which is one that was very important to my own understanding of development, was working on another dam, this time on the River Biobío in Chile, in Pehuenche territory, on Pehuenche land, where very few people were resettled, but the dam had to disturb much of the Aviano groves, the hazelnut groves along the river, just below the volcano. And what I think none of the investors in that project, nor the World Bank Group, nor the government of Chile for that matter, really understood was that the relationship of the Pehuenche to the soil, to the Aviano, to the actual water. And I remember standing behind a small hut, which was now standing vacant because the two elderly sisters that lived in it had been forced to move, which is a longer story, which I won't bother you with now. And I was talking to one of the sisters, the one that spoke Spanish. And she said to me, sort of putting her hand against a hazelnut tree, feeling its bark. And she said, if you take me away from this tree, if you take my feet away from this land, if you take my eyes away from the stars, I will die. And I think that understanding the true significance of heritage, the true significance of cultural or natural or spiritual or religious heritage is something which we need to strive to do. So today, I wish you all the very best in pursuing these issues. It's very close to my heart, as you can tell. And I'm really grateful to all the organizers that we can continue this tradition. And so less from me, more from experts, more from all of you. Please join me in welcoming Susan Hayward, a Fletcher and Harvard Divinity School alumna, and currently the Associate Director for Religion and Public Life at the Harvard Divinity School. Thank you.
Can you all hear me? All right. Thank you, Dean Kite, and thank you for both your introduction and for those powerful anecdotes that share the importance of Indigenous worldviews and understandings of land that intersect and need to be taken into consideration with development initiatives. I'm looking forward to talking a little bit more about that, but also to all the ways in which the presenters will illuminate some of those and other considerations about the relationship between religion, spirituality, culture, and heritage, and international policies and practices and development. So as Dean Kite said, I am Susie Hayward. I am an alumna of this school, and it's always great to be back at Fletcher. I sometimes tell the anecdote that when I was a student here, the only class that had anything to do on religion was a half-credit course on Islamic finance. And so it's remarkable and exciting that there is now this initiative here and other classes that are looking at religion and taking religion seriously as a dimension that shapes international affairs and that needs to be taken into consideration in developing policy and development practices and programs. Wish it had existed when I was here, but I'm really glad that it exists now for the students. And I want to thank as well Miriam and Ciara from the RLD in particular, who are carrying on the mantle of being Fletcher and HDS dual degree students. It's a rich intersection. So I'm with the Religion and Public Life program at Harvard Divinity School, as Dean Kite said, and RPL seeks to advance the public understanding of religion in service of a just world at peace. So one of the things we do is work with international policymakers, domestic policymakers, humanitarian workers, organizers, understanding that religion is a dimension of human society that shapes political, economic, and social systems, and helping those professionals who are working to advance just peace develop a greater understanding of just how religion intersects with the work that they're doing and how they can take it into account in order to strengthen their efforts to advance justice. We also work with students who are preparing to go into those vocations. And then prior to that, I spent 14 years at the US Institute of Peace in Washington, DC, and led their Religion and Inclusive Societies program. So what you'll be hearing today will be drawing from both of those things. I'm gonna give you a little bit of the dog and pony show on religious literacy and international affairs, but I'm also going to take some time to try to make it relevant to the particular topics that you'll be exploring today and what a religious literacy approach, what kinds of questions you might be holding as you hear the presentations today and think about the implications for policy and practice. So let's begin. I'm going to begin with a quick poll. I'm curious, I'm going to say a statement, and I want you to choose from three options, either agree, disagree, or neither agree nor disagree with this statement, okay? Don't overthink it. There's not a right or a wrong answer. It's just about how you respond to the statement that I'm going to say, and both cognitively and emotionally. So the statement is, in the modern era, religion and traditional culture has contributed more to violence and injustice than to peace and human rights. In the modern era, religion and traditional culture has contributed more to violence and injustice than to peace and human rights. All right, agree, disagree, neither agree nor disagree. Let's see the agrees. Can you put your hands up if you agree with that statement? Okay. Can I see the disagrees? Okay. And how about the neither agree nor disagrees? All right. It's actually pretty evenly mixed here. Can I just get a couple folks to say why they chose the one they did? Yes, we need to unpack that statement, and we will. But what did you choose? Did you say neither agree nor disagree? Because you needed some unpacking of the definitions that we're using. Okay, thank you. Somebody else? There in the back? For agree, because of the doctrine of discovery and the role that it's played, and colonialism, imperialism, vast amounts of violence. And for those who aren't aware, the doctrine of discovery was a papal bull that was issued in the 15th century that gave legitimacy to conquistador imperialism, colonialism, incredible amounts of violence against indigenous communities here in the Americas and elsewhere. Thank you. Anybody else? One quick reflection from someone else. Here we go.
The word traditional is often used within
the word traditional is misused, I think, in all religions to put women down and keep a really sexist, like hurtful stance.
Yeah, so the ways in which religion and traditional culture have been used to reinforce patriarchy or gender violence. Can we just get, before I move on, can we get one person who disagreed? Say why? Thank you, yeah.
There's a lot of modern conflicts that are framed in religious terms, but there is also a lot of, supportive communities and like good things being done by those communities in the name of religion that don't really get, the same amount of attention. And just because it's not discussed as much doesn't mean it's not happening and it's not a source of value for a lot of people. So that's why I said disagree.
Okay, thank you. So we tend to see the ways in which religion is contributing or being drawn on to legitimate or motivate violence, but there's an ambivalence in how religion responds. Sam, and then I'll move on. Yeah, our poor Zoomers.
Take two of it. Thank you. I actually thought that there was a funny dichotomy between religion and tradition, because what is more traditional than indigeneity? And I think religion implies a lot of institutionalism, but I focus more on the way that I was thinking about the tradition or indigenous context, indigenous ways and practices of being. And so for that reason, I disagreed.
Thanks, Sam. So the focus on indigeneity kind of, in some ways, put in tension with institutional religion, which goes back to the how are we defining these questions that was raised at the beginning. You see, I hate that picture of myself, I told them, but there we go. Okay. So we're going to come back to all of this, and we're going to do some unpacking as was requested. But I want to start with defining what religious literacy is. And we say religious literacy in the program that I'm in, but I'm going to extend it a bit today to talk about religious and cultural literacy. Religion and culture are very religion is an aspect of culture in some ways. Culture is a broader category in the way that I understand it, at least. But I think there's a lot of ways when I speak about religious literacy, it's speaking about a particular form of cultural literacy. It has implications for more largely thinking about the role of culture in shaping worldviews, norms, and practices, and so on. So this call for religious literacy has been something of a rallying cry within international affairs. Certainly in the world that I'm in, maybe in the world that you've been into. I think the fact that there is a religion, law, and diplomacy student group here now is an illustration of the ways that there has been increasing recognition of the gaps in international relations theory and practice previously in understanding what religion has to do in fundamentally shaping some of the international legal system, international practices and organizations and norms, and the need to have a greater understanding of some of those religious dimensions that are impacting those systems and understandings in order to better advance justice, development goals, peace, and so on. So there's been this call for increasing religious literacy among diplomats and foreign ministries, within international organizations, and so on. But what exactly is religious literacy? It's a couple things. I actually define it in three ways myself, but there's the way that it is defined by the program that I'm in is this way. And this is a definition that was put forward by Professor Dr. Diane Elmore, who is the head of the Religion and Public Life program at the Divinity School. So it entails the ability to discern and analyze the fundamental intersections of religion. Again, I added this in as a component of culture more broadly, and the social, political, economic life through multiple lenses. So the outcome, somebody who is religiously literate, and I should say that that is a process, not an end goal, because religions, as we will talk about soon, are constantly changing and dynamic and complex. So one is never fully religiously literate, but one who is enhancing their religious literacy has a basic understanding of the history and central texts where applicable. Indigenous religions often don't have texts. Beliefs, practices, and contemporary manifestations of several of the world's religious traditions and expressions as they arose out of particular times and places, particular social, historical, and cultural contexts. This dimension of religious literacy is often referred to as the substantive or the confessional approach to religious literacy. It's understanding the difference between Sunni and Shia Islam, between Theravada and Vajrayana Buddhism, between Islam as it's practiced in Nigeria and Islam as it's practiced in North America, and so on. And then secondly, the ability to discern and explore the religious dimensions, both explicit dimensions of religion, the religious language that's used, the religious institutions in society, as well as embedded, some of the religious worldviews and norms and assumptions that might be operating underneath the surface, including in what we define as secular spaces or secular systems, but may not be explicit, may not be seen, may not, there may be worldviews operating, but it's not in religious language that we would identify as religious, but nonetheless is still shaping those systems and institutions. So it's the ability to see that and to analyze it and to understand it across time and place. We sometimes call that the religious studies approach to religious literacy. And then the third approach that I sometimes talk about, but I'm not going to talk about it today, is religious engagement approach. And that's as a policymaker, as a development practitioner, how do you, recognizing the influence that religion has as a social and a political and economic force, how do you begin to engage with explicitly religious institutions and actors in ways that are just, in ways that are strategic, in ways that are inclusive, so that you don't unintentionally reinforce things like patriarchy, as was mentioned, or other forms of communal violence and so on in your engagement. And importantly, in the US context, how do you do so legally as well, in keeping with the Establishment Clause of the Constitution? Again, that's a talk for another day. But what I want to say is that this is the prescription that is offered for that diagnosis that I spoke to just a minute ago, the diagnosis that international affairs and practice hasn't sufficiently considered the religious dimensions. And so the need for these kinds of religious literacy in order to be more effective in addressing some of the urgent issues of our times, like climate collapse or increasing strains on democracy, or human rights violations and economic inequalities and so on. Now, both of these dimensions of religious literacy depend on a couple key principles. One is that religions are lived. And what I mean by that is that they are not monolithic. They are not static. Religions are internally incredibly diverse or plural. As I said, what Islam looks like in Nigeria and what Islam looks like in North America is very different, right? But you can even go in North America itself, and you can find many different expressions and understandings of what is key in Islam, how Islam is practiced, and so on. So recognizing that religions are incredibly internally diverse and that they're constantly changing, they're dynamic because they're constantly being contested and interpreted and reinterpreted by those within those religious traditions. So it's always a problem to make sweeping generalized statements about any religious tradition. And I'm including here both the institutional or colonial religions that we're familiar with, like Christianity and Islam, as well as indigenous religions, which are, of course, themselves incredibly diverse and dynamic, and are often sweeping generalizations are made by them. And then the other important thing, actually, before I move on, let me just say as well that with religions being lived and with the internal contradictions that sometimes exist as they're being interpreted, contested, and reinterpreted, this means that religions in any context are going to have ambivalent influences, as was being mentioned by our friend up there in the back who disagreed with the statement. There's going to be members of those communities who are interpreting their traditions and mobilizing resources within religious communities in ways that can both drive what we would think of as unjust practices and policies, and on the other side of it, religion that's being used and mobilized in ways that can drive peace and reconciliation and climate care and so on. And those ambivalent forces and manifestations of religion are always happening, I would say, in one context, much less around the world. So again, you always need to be careful when you're hearing, or think critically when you're hearing kind of sweeping statements made about religions generally, but also religions in any particular context, recognizing that lived nature of religion and the ambivalence of religion. And then secondly, to go back, another principle to remember is right sizing, which is an idea that Peter Mandeville, who's George Mason University and now at the US Institute of Peace, has written about. He sort of, when he was working in the State Department, he was using this term, and it's now become kind of accepted by a lot of folks. But the idea of right-sizing religion is that you're neither under nor overemphasizing the religious dimensions in any particular context, shaping any particular context or any particular issue. So for example, if you're seeking to understand the genocide against the Rohingya in Myanmar, for example, some might be tempted to say that Buddhist nationalism, Buddhist activism, and forms of Buddhist supremacy are what motivated and led to, legitimated, created the conditions that allowed for violence against the Rohingya community. Yeah, that's true in part. And there were also economic issues, a desire to build oil pipelines from China through the area that the Rohingya were living on. There were political issues in the competition between the military in Myanmar and the NLD, the National League of Democracy, at the time. And so those were also motivating it. So if you're overemphasizing those religious dimensions, forms of Buddhist supremacy, then your policy solutions are going to focus on the religious dimensions, but maybe not give sufficient attention to those economic dimensions and those political dimensions. So hence the importance of always right-sizing religion, neither over nor under-emphasizing it. Okay, so I want to return now to the diagnosis that I started with issues related to religion have not been, or the effects of religion in the international system and the way it shapes the international system and international practices have not been sufficiently understood. And I want to apply this sort of religious literacy approach to understanding why that might be the case, and why there might also be oftentimes a sense that religion, traditional culture, that these are threats to the international system, to international order, and to the advance of peace and violence. So remember, this is about being able to discern and explore the religious dimensions of political, social, and economic expressions across religion, across time and place. So that's what we're seeking to do with the religious literacy approach or analysis. So if we were to apply it to understanding why that might be the case, why there might be this sort of normative assumption, or both a blinder to understanding religion, but also an assumption of its negative impact on peace and human rights, we would want to look historically at the development of international legal and political systems at a particular time and place. So there was a question of when does modernity, what do we count as the beginning of modernity? What's often stated as the beginning of modernity was the European Enlightenment and the rise of the modern state and the international political order that rests on the idea of the modern state. There's, can be disagreements about that, but that's the assumption that I'm making here about when the modern era begins. So where did that happen? I just said it. Yes, Western Europe, right? And what was going on in Western Europe right before those events? A lot of wars that we often call religious wars or confessional wars, right? The Protestant Reformation happened, and there was religious pluralism that was existing in the countries of Europe, and it was created in empires in Europe, and was creating political competition. And it went on for well over a century and created a lot of destruction. And so the creation of the new modern state, which rested on this separation of religious and political authority and spheres of influence, was hoped to be a resolution to these types of wars. If we can separate religious and political authority, then we might be able to ensure that there isn't going to be this kind of violence manifest within the continent moving forward. And supporting that new political system was a lot of the ideas of the European Enlightenment about the rise of modern science, the rise of empiricism, as also, which accompanied this new notion of the secular, something that is not religious or neutral towards religion, as something that would help with human progress, would help with advancing justice, human rights, and peace. So this, in the course of creating the new modern state and this new political system that then subsequently over the next couple of centuries became the international legal order and the international system, there was also a process of, there had to be this process of legitimating it, right? Of legitimating the new secular modern state and system. And in the process of doing so, the secular was defined as good, as rational, as supportive of progress, and religion and traditional culture were being argued to be irrational, backwards, archaic, a threat to the modern state, and a threat to the international order. The new modern system, the new modern state, the new international legal order would help to ensure we moved beyond those archaic and religious practices that were a threat to the international system. These ideas are what drove subsequently colonialism, different forms of imperialism, and I would argue still persist today in some of the practices of humanitarianism and development. Now, this is a very broad sweep, and I'm doing this very quickly because I don't have much time. So there's a lot more complexity to dig in to with everything that I just said. But what I'm seeking to do, and just giving you that little taste of applying the religious literacy approach to understanding international affairs and the diagnosis that I began with, is to demonstrate how this application of a religious literacy approach, a religious studies approach, can help us think critically about how that historically and contextually derived conception of religion was driven by particular power interests, and its co-constitutive conception of the secular, similarly shaped by particular political agendas and power interests. And those developed, and they continue to operate within and shape how we interpret and respond to global events, and how at schools like Fletcher and elsewhere, we continue to think about what the role of international policy making and the international legal order and so on. There's still manifestations of that. There's been a critical turn in this decolonial movement that is challenging some of those base assumptions, but it still operates to a large extent. And that shows up in two dominant ways. One, thinking of religion as this distinct sphere of life that is disentangled from the political. It's private, it's about individual belief. It's separate from the secular realm of politics. When in reality, even what we define as the secular, especially its normativity, the things that it considers just and good and that it is pushing forward as the shoulds, is shaped by, underneath, embedded, often Protestant Christian understandings of what religion is, of how to create progress, and so on and so forth. Those are operating within our secular international system as a result of where it arose out of. But then two, in understanding religion and traditional, or traditional can sometimes be code for non-European derived cultures, to be a threat to modernity, not taking into account sufficiently the ambivalence of the sacred, as Scott Appleby describes it. And sometimes in ways that let the so-called secular off the hook for the ways that it has been complicit in driving colonialism, climate collapse, economic exploitation, and the ills of capitalism, and so on. So that the aim of this exercise and of religious literacy generally is to help you better critique the ways in which the religious and the secular are being discussed within international policy spaces and practices, the way they're being analyzed, the way that they're being engaged, and to intervene, at least internally, if not in conversations, so as to help disrupt problematic assumptions that are operating and help ensure the pursuit of justice. And again, this warrants like a whole another half hour, but I think this is particularly important for this turn, this increased rallying cry to decolonize the international system, recognizing that it has often operated in ways that have been harmful to communities outside of Western Europe or the West. Okay, so I want to connect some of this to what you're going to be talking about today and the theme. I have time. Okay. All right, cool. Is it possible for me to play this video? Do we know how to do that? No. Okay. What this video is, no problem, don't worry about it, I got it. What this video is just a very succinct introduction to Johann Galtung's idea of direct structural and cultural violence. Now, I know there's some students in the room who know what direct structural and cultural violence is in Galtung's description of it. Can I have one of those brave students at least give me a definition of what cultural violence is? They're all looking at each other. They're all in a class that I help co-teach where we talk about this. Owen, come on.
Thank you. Galtung proposes this triangle, I suppose, of different forms of violence, direct being what we often think of as physical violence, often within direct conflict of one another. Cultural and systemic are a little more nuanced of culture, kind of the violence that is deeply embedded, similar to the way the religion has been leveraged in different ways, embedded in the culture for both good and bad purposes, that the violence that it might perpetrate. And then on the other kind of end of the triangle, I suppose, when cultural and direct violence act in conflicts with one another, it becomes a systemic form of violence that perpetuates all different aspects of the culture and the system that I guess, religion or other aspects of the culture are operating within.
Good job. He's going to law school next year, so I'm testing out Socratic method with him. Good job. So yeah, the direct violence, explicit forms of violence that we're familiar with, war, sexual violence and rape, different kinds of abuse to both humans and non-human animals. Structural violence are the forms of systemic discrimination that create policies and practices on a large structural sense that harm particular communities and benefit other communities. And cultural violence are the particular ideas or ideologies, ideological systems that make those forms of structural discrimination seem normal and seem rational, and that then allow for also those forms of direct violence to take place. So I want you to hold that understanding particularly of cultural violence, the particular understandings, ideas, norms of what's good and what's bad and what's just and so on, and how those forms, those ideas shape then how our systems and our structures operate and what violence is considered good violence or normal violence, and what violence is considered abnormal or harmful violence or backwards violence. And I want to offer you a few questions holding that and holding the religious literacy approach that you might consider as you're thinking about the topic today. So again, this is religious literacy is looking both at religion in the sense of explicit religion, religion as we understand and see it visibly, religious actors who define themselves religiously, institutions and organizations who define themselves by their religious identity and practices, particular religious ideas that are framed within theological doctrinal commitments and so on. That's the explicit dimension. And then the implicit are some of those religious worldviews and understandings that aren't visible, aren't expressly religious necessarily, but are sometimes operating underneath the surface in shaping particular worldviews. So with respect to conservation, crisis, and cultural heritage, if you're thinking about the explicit, of course, places associated with religious history and figures that imbue it with sacred significance. So sacred space, obviously. I mean, Dean Kite was speaking to in the indigenous worldviews in Guatemala, particular understandings of the connection between ideas of the sacred and spiritual and actual places where development projects are taking place. There's also sacred spaces in the sense of Mount Kailash in Tibet, for example, considered sacred to many different religious traditions, Hinduism and Buddhism, and Bon among them. And also with respect to explicit, another one that I suspect is going to be obvious is places that are targeted as a result of competition and conflict because they are associated with particular religious communities or traditions that are deemed a threat. So in Sri Lanka, when the sacred temple of the tooth, sacred to the Buddhist communities, because it houses a relic of the Buddha, was targeted by the liberation tigers of Tamil Elam. There's an attempt to hit these places precisely because they are held in significance by communities as part of competition. Again, these might be explicit ways in which we see religion intersecting. But what about the implicit? That's a little bit more complicated to start to wrap your head around, but that's actually where the fun happens, I would suggest. So how do embedded religious and cultural understandings about land influence normative policies and practices? Let's just talk about our legal system in the US and how it understands land, the understanding of the relationship between humans and land that operates within legal codes on property rights, thinking of land as property. If you dig under the surface there a little bit, that you might relate that back to different Christian understandings of land as humans having dominion over land. Land is an object to be cared for, exploited for the purpose of humankind as dictated by the biblical understanding of why land was created, how land was created, and how God commanded the relationship between humankind and land. Some Native American indigenous worldviews have a very different understanding of land, and the relationship between humans and land is far more interconnected, far more interrelated, not something to be owned, to have property rights over. So then how do we think about our legal system and the ways in which our legal systems map on in ways that can be imperfect fits or even harmful to some communities because of some of these worldviews, some of them shaped by religious and cultural assumptions that are the ideological groundwork on which these legal systems operate. How do religious and cultural ideas shape understanding of certain people or communities that then influence whether or not what they considered culturally significant is acknowledged? So again, if we're thinking about Galtung and cultural violence, the ideas that we have about certain peoples and communities that then dictate how our systems and our structures treat those people and those communities. How do legal and political definitions of religion or culture map on neatly or not to different global traditions or communities? In addition to what I said earlier, I'll just say one more thing here, which is that the legal definition of religion in the international system, what is often used for religious freedom, human rights advocacy, and legal actions, that definition, as has been criticized by a lot of scholars, is a definition of religion that maps on very neatly to, for example, Protestant Christianity, with a focus on belief in particular, but may not map on as neatly to other forms of religious practice and religious traditions where things like practice might be more important than belief. And oftentimes then the ways in which religious freedom has been advanced has sometimes been to the benefit of certain religious communities for whom that definition fits neatly, and has left behind others, like indigenous communities in the US, for example. We had a really powerful woman, Susan Harjo, who's done a lot of work on advancing religious freedom, the Indian Religious Freedom Act in the US, which wasn't passed until 1976 or 1978. She spoke at the Divinity School earlier this year, and one thing she said that stuck with me is that we had to fit ourselves within the box of religious freedom in order to get our stuff back, in order to get our rights. And there were some things we lost when we had to fit what we consider our cultural and spiritual systems into that box, that legal box, that conceptual category of religion that's operating within the legal system. And then finally here, what power interests shape what's deemed culturally and religiously significant and what isn't? How does religion intersect with those power interests in ways that drive or subvert them? So I throw those out to you just as suggestions for what it might look like for you to be thinking critically about religion in this religious literacy approach today, as you're thinking about these hugely important questions that you're going to be looking at, and what those questions, the answers to those questions offer in different places and contexts, and then how the international system mobilizes in response to those questions in ways that could be more just when critically interrogated in this way. Okay, I need to wrap up. The only other thing I was going to share with you is just there's a lot, if this interests you and you want to go down this rabbit hole, which is a really fun rabbit hole, I promise you, there's a lot of resources out there to help you develop, to increase your religious literacy or your curiosity and your ability to kind of think critically about religion in these spaces. So a couple example are courses that we have on Harvard X that is an online platform. They're free to do. The Religion and Inclusive Societies program at the U.S. Institute of Peace has a number of handbooks that they've put out over the last few years that take you through processes of thinking critically about projects or programs that might be done in the peace building space that intersect with religion, and ask questions. There's one on religion and gender, for example, to get to an issue that was raised earlier. We have a number of case studies on our website that help give you a context and then help ask the kinds of questions like I was asking here that help you think critically about what religion has to do with various issues. The Transnational Network for Religion and Diplomacy that we call TIPNerd also has its own website and has a lot of resources on it as well that are addressing both that confessional substantive approach. What does Christianity in Bolivia, Catholic and Pentecostal forms of Christianities there, how is that influencing the political system, as well as that religious studies approach that's thinking critically about how political and economic systems are being shaped by particular religious worldviews. And I will now pass it on to Costa, who's going to introduce the first panel. So thank you, everybody. This was fun. Have fun with the rest of the day.